Hello and welcome to the Missing Link webinar. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jane. I'm the co-founder of JBH, the digital PR agency, and also the host of the Missing Link webinar. And so thank you for joining us. We've got a really good turnout today for what I think is a very interesting and challenging topic. And I think obviously it's resonating with a lot of people. So I wanted to get somebody on that really knows his stuff when it comes to content, especially the digital PR. So I would like to welcome Mark Johnston. He is a creative content consultant, and he also has an amazing website called Content Hubble and a podcast. So please check out everything he does. I spent hours on his old website recently, not realizing there was a new one, but I'm sure the new one will be even better than the old one. So please check it out and listen to his podcast. And I think I'll hand over to Mark just to kind of introduce himself and tell you a little bit more about his background and kind of what he does with people now and kind of his techniques, etc. And then we'll kind of start talking about ideation and the challenges, etc. So I think we'll do kind of 30-35 minutes, and then we'll kind of open up to questions. So please feel free to ask any questions at all. There are no stupid questions, and I will try and get to all of them. I normally do it chronologically, so please, if I miss you out, it's not no offense intended, etc. But yeah, so please ask any questions. Just pop them in the question section underneath the screen. And yes, now I'll hand over to Mark to tell you a little bit more about himself.
Cool. Thank you for having me. I'll try to keep the story short, but I started in SEO about, I think it's 10 or 11 years ago. I've slightly lost count. And it was around that time really that the creating content for links was becoming bigger and bigger. And even, the idea of bringing digital PR into it was just kind of arriving. Like, I started at Distilled the same day they hired Lexi Mills, who was one of the first PRs I knew that was hired by an SEO agency. And we were trying to figure out together, me and Lexi and some of the others in the team, how do you create content that gets links? And there really wasn't that much guidance within the industry at the time. We kind of had to figure it all out ourselves. And I spent quite a bit of time studying in the data viz community, because obviously so much of what we do is data driven, and particularly visuals, the visual side of data, like infographics, data visualization. It's all kind of the same thing. And then I also learned a lot from people in the world of advertising, because even though people were saying, advertising is dead, it's all about content. Really, I think the people in advertising had a much longer and stronger history of coming up with creative ideas. They had more of a process and framework.
They've had 100 years, whereas I think we've had like 10 years, if that.
Yeah, and SEO had such an analytical background, so I learned a lot from both of those industries. And kind of figured out as I went along with the help of the people I was working with. And then so we kind of built up the team at Distilled over sort of about 5 years. I built the creative team up there. I sort of established the team, made the pitch to the bosses, hey, we should have one, built it up. We started creating a lot of content that was very successful in terms of links, etc. And then about 4 years ago, I left the agency and went out on my own. I was doing some consulting. Mostly I do a lot of training. So I train teams and agencies and brands how to come up with content ideas, and also how to assess those ideas and how to develop them further. Because often when an idea arrives, it's not in its fully fledged form. You've got to carve it out a bit. So I do a lot of that. And Content Hubble and the podcast Content Deconstructed is really, looking back, I'm trying to create what I wish existed when I was starting out. I had to go and scramble in the data viz community and advertising, and I was even running around asking anyone I could think of if they would be a mentor, or if they could recommend a mentor for me, but I couldn't quite find the right person because nobody was doing exactly what we do now. This field was really in its infancy. Thankfully, it's developed now. There's a lot of people doing good work that we can learn from and sharing their insights. But that didn't really exist back then. So that's what Content Hubble aims to be. And you're right. I kind of have 2 or 3 different sites. They will all be merge soon and it'll all be in one place. But it's just taking me a little longer than I anticipated. There's just me over here. There's no big team around me or anything.
Either way, if they go to the old one, I don't think they're going to be disappointed. Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for that introduction. So obviously you do a lot of training with teams, and you've just done some training with my team too that they found kind of super useful. And I know that, you know, there's a lot of challenges that kind of come with ideation, and you must kind of come across those all the time when you're working kind of with teams or with individuals. Are there like a few that really stand out as the most common challenges?
Yeah, I'll start actually with the common questions, because that's quite interesting. At the start of my workshops, I generally ask everyone, what questions do you have about this? And it seems like I had a lot of foresight with this at the time, but really it was just, I guess it was partially luck. But I wrote down every single question I ever got asked in a workshop.
Wow.
And then I actually mind mapped them recently, and I could see, right, okay, and categorize them. These are all the questions people want to know, and I could see which ones are coming up time and time again. And so the two most obvious ones are the really top level. How do you come up with ideas that get lots of links, get lots of coverage, and then how do you know which ones to pursue? Which is kind of what the whole workshop is about, right?
The holy grail of questions.
Yeah.
Really.
But it was the more specific ones that are quite interesting. The one, and we'll talk about this a bunch today, and I've just written a blog post about it as well, is that how do you get out of a content rut? That was a very specific language that they used, and it got used a lot. And that really surprised me. I would never have thought of that. I wouldn't even have thought of the phrase, but that was the phrase that people use. So how do you get stuck out of a rut? And usually that means, I ask them, but they usually mean, we keep creating the same thing. I remember one person asked it specifically. She said, how do I convince my colleagues to stop creating these fashion guides? That's all we create. Now, interestingly, actually, I asked that person, are they working? And she said, yes. And I'm like, well, okay. And that is often part of the challenge, is that they're kind of feel a bit stuck churning out the same thing, but actually often they are working to some extent as well. So often there's a bit of a balancing act, but obviously they kind of want to do more than just keep doing that same thing. And maybe there's greater gains to be made if they can leave their comfort zone and try some new things.
I was just about to mention the comfort zone, because if you are building links and you are doing it well, you wonder why you change that up and maybe risk and take that risk. So I can see kind of where people are coming from in that respect. But, even from my own experience, you do get bored of doing the same kinds of campaigns over and over again. And, often you do desperately want to change it up, but you don't know whether it's the right time to take that risk, or whether it's the right client, or there's so many kind of variables that kind of go into that decision.
Yeah, there's an interesting part there. If you get a bit bored of it, there can be a little bit of a danger there. If you're churning out the same format, or there's certain words around. Churning's a little bit of a loaded word. But if you're creating the same thing each time, or putting out similar formats, if you get a little bored of them, there's a little danger there, because I think obviously every idea needs to resonate. It needs to resonate with the people that it's intended for, and ideally it somehow resonates a little with you. Because if you are completely bored and unmoved by an idea, there's a little bit of a warning sign there that maybe the idea itself is actually not very moving. And that's the bit that's actually the kind of the biggest thing that people need to ensure that their ideas have, if they are using a slightly formulaic approach or using similar formats. If they disengage too much from the process, you have to make sure that actual angle you're creating is going to be engaging, that it's going to move somebody. And there's a little danger there. I remember one specific market I was working in where I wasn't that interested in it. So I made a piece that I wasn't very interested in, but I was like, but they'll find it interesting. And that's a little bit dangerous, because you can sometimes make something that's a little bit shallow, or even sometimes, if you're not careful, you can make something that's a little bit patronizing if you make something for an audience that you're like, I don't care, but they'll care. So you just have to be careful to check, is this something that people really care about?
Definitely, yeah. And I think that's a really good point. And about you know, if you're doing the same thing time and time again, do you become a bit blasé about it? Do you take your eye off the ball a little bit? Yeah, you get, and also, you know, you've got these relationships with journalists, and if you're sending them the same stuff time and time again, are they going to get a bit bored? Are you risking relationships as well?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of early warning signs that you're getting into that zone. Is that, yeah, you have this sense, like, you know, that when people are asking about the content rut, they obviously have a little nagging feeling like, oh, this isn't that creative. And then you do see tweets from journalists about certain formats. You know, I posted one in the blog post about a journalist that complained about the most Instagrammed X, the most Instagrammed Y. And these things continue to work. So I don't completely knee-jerk to a journalist reaction, because I've heard journalists say that they, you know, they won't cover surveys, they won't cover infographics, they won't cover maps. And I'm like, that's a lot of stuff to eliminate. I'm pretty sure that you actually will still cover some of these. Usually what they mean there is they're tired of seeing, well, one, yeah, okay, the format doesn't have the novelty appeal anymore, but also they're tired of seeing bad ones. That's a big thing of what they're saying. There can still be room for a good version in any format if it's something that people really want to know or really want to see.
Definitely. If it's a good story with a strong angle, then it doesn't really matter about the format so much, does it? Because you can still do something with it.
Yeah. Yeah, like some quick examples, you know, like an index is a format that people get maybe a little bit tired of, but Digital Loft did that piece recently on the cosmetic, well, it's probably not that recent now, but the Cosmetify Index. What are the most popular brands and products across the world, beauty products across the world? Now, that is something that people really care about. You know, I know that my partner and sister frequently discuss different beauty brands and skincare brands, and there's all these new ones cropping up, and loads of celebrities and influencers have their own one. This is something people try to stay on top of, and so that is interesting. But it's, yeah, so there are still possibilities within each format, as long as we make sure it resonates.
Definitely. So we talked about kind of what can go wrong when we get stuck in this rut. What tips can you offer to help us kind of get out of it, to kind of, you know, make some changes?
Yeah, there's quite a lot at play here. I always kind of ask people, you know, what they're doing and how they're feeling when they get into this rut. Actually, one thing I meant to say on the question side of things, another question I get asked a lot, which surprised me, but it is a good question, is how do you get in a creative space? Again, that's the phrasing they ask. And I think space is an interesting question, because to me, that opens up a few different ways of answering that. I think, you know, some people like to change the physical space they're working in when it's time to be creative. I think that's a good idea, because we're creatures of habit. And when you sit down at your normal desk, you will go into your normal work mode, your normal mode of being. Not only will you probably automatically open up your emails and yada, yada, but whatever state you're in when you normally work. And that's probably not your most creative state, I would imagine. So you can change the physical space. The digital space I think of, which is really just closing down everything and being focused, which is a big challenge. And I think that's a huge part of it too. And then the headspace, again, which is largely related to distractions, but also just almost getting out of your head a little bit and getting into your body. Like, if I ask people what they do to get into a creative space, they'll say things like, some people say they'll do a little bit of stretching, go for a walk, maybe some yoga, meditation. Some people talk about burning incense. These are all things that help you come back to your senses a little bit, you know, so get a little bit more mindful, bring your attention back into the body. I've heard people talk about creativity being a full contact sport, you know, because actually it's not just about your head, but when you're doing research and you're surfing the internet, you're noticing for something that maybe grabs you, and that will probably cause some kind of like a physical sensation. It could be small, but just that, oh, that's interesting. What's that over there? And so it's noticing when you're having these small, you know, small emotional responses, because eventually we want to create an emotional response to what we create. So some of the challenges I was quickly trying to remember what the actual question was you asked.
Sorry.
But one is, a big one though, is not carving out time and space for yourself to do this. And that, a large part of that is, I mean, how often do many of us sit down and do even an hour of uninterrupted work now? You know, even an hour. But let's say I would like to see that stretched to 2 hours where you do nothing but a single task. And that's really rare. But
It's
that's
difficult.
how you
It's really
yeah,
hard.
and that's kind of, we should really be thinking about that a lot more. And for any work that we do, you know, because there's a lot of, there's a lot of studies on the kind of the challenge with context switching and ramp up times. Like, it can take you 20 minutes to fully get back into a task every time you switch.
Wow.
And most people probably won't even go 20 minutes without checking their email or checking their Twitter or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think it's carving out time and space, because people often tell me that they tend to go for the safe options or their familiar options because they're under pressure.
Yeah.
Now, and I know a lot of the pressure and the time challenges will feel like they're external, but there are things that we can do to try and protect that time and give ourselves a kind of enough time to explore something. And another thing that can be useful to do is so I do a lot of research for ideas. Rather than relying on yourself to just come up with what's already in your head, go out and find out what's popular in this area by looking at popular publications, Google News, BuzzSumo, whatever you like, Reddit, whatever. And you're looking for the things that are resonating with other people. And I find it can be useful if within that session, the way you frame your intention can really change essentially how you feel and also what you do. And I think that varies by, if you go in with, I've got to come up with an idea, I've got to come up with an idea, that applies quite a lot of pressure, and it might make you reach for a kind of off-the-shelf preformed what you think an idea is. But actually, if you go in more with the intention of, I want to find out what's interesting in this area, I'm going to dig into the things that jump out at me and find out more about what people are talking about and care about within this area, and then think about, what else would I like to know? Like, or what would I like to be able to see? Because really, when we're creating, so I don't find the word content very useful. Like, what is content? It's everything.
It'll be absolutely everything.
I kind of a lot of what I do is visualizing data, or you could be infographics. But I just think of that as like visual forms of information. Mm-hmm. And there's a quote that says, innovation is doing things differently or doing different things. And I think when we're creating or presenting information visually, we are either presenting new information or we're presenting information in a new way, or ideally maybe even a little bit of both. But so when I'm researching, I'm looking for what's interesting here, but then thinking, what else would I like to know? Or what else would I like to be able to see? Yeah. Like, if, an example, I'm researching in, I had to research for everything that gets written about drivers in regional press in the UK. And I found one story about a speed camera in Glasgow that has made several million pounds this year from all the people it's caught. Just one camera. So instantly, what else do you want to know? Like, how much are all the other cameras in Glasgow? Like, how much money are they making? How does this compare to other cities? How much money in total do the government make from this? What do they do with that money? Like, all these things that you'd like to either be able to know or to be able to see. And so I like to find what resonates, what sparks an interest, and then jot down my questions. What would I like to be able to see here? What does this make me think of?
And then I guess if you've got questions and there's things you'd like to see, that means there's potential gaps. And one of our challenges these days is, not that there ever was any really new ideas, but finding something more unique, that is challenging. So if you spot anything that hasn't quite been done in the way you'd like to see it, then that's an opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes there can be opportunities simply in the way it's presented. We did a piece ages ago about, there was a piece done that visualized how creative people spent their day. Very famous creative people like Freud and Darwin and maybe Mozart. I can't remember who all was in it. But the way they visualize, it was really interesting visualization. I'm interested in productivity and creativity and data visualization. So I was like the perfect audience for this thing. But the way they visualized it in circles made it quite hard to extract the information. So yeah, we spotted the challenge there that I'd like to be able to easily look across it and compare how much, when they worked, when they slept, when they took breaks, and try and, these are all things that get talked about in the worlds of success and productivity and all that, entrepreneurship and all that jazz. And I just wanted to be able to see that really easily. So yeah, you're kind of looking for maybe asking like, what's the challenge with this information, or what else? What's next? What's the next thing we could do with this?
Definitely. You mentioned something kind of earlier, which kind of links to what I wanted to kind of talk about anyway. And that was kind of getting yourself into the right kind of headspace and having a curious mindset. I know not everybody has that kind of natural lean towards kind of being creative. And, so it's going to be tougher for some than it is for others. And, like you say, kind of having ideas at different times of the day and maybe when you're more relaxed kind of helps. But is there anything else that's really useful in order to kind of make yourself open to kind of new opportunities and ideas?
I think there's an amazing book, and it's the shortest book I've ever read, and it's packed with insight into the creative process by an old ad exec, and it's called A Technique for Producing Ideas. It's literally only about 40 pages long, and the pages are tiny and the text is massive. Like there's no excuse not to read this. There's no excuse not to read this book. But he talks about the preparation stage for creativity, and he says that there's sort of specific preparation, and we could think of this really as sort of information gathering. I suppose there's also an element of practicing the skills, but there's specifically would be when you get a brief, you would go and gather information and whatever inspiration you want to find on that specific topic. But the more general preparation is what you're doing, not when you have a specific brainstorm or a specific brief to respond to. And that's gathering, people like spending time just knowing what's going on generally in the news, I guess. But really, you're knowing what's happening in terms of the different trends and stuff. But really, for me, it's about gathering lots of examples of creative campaigns that you like, and lots of different ones. And maybe going a little bit further as well, because I find that some people can look at them and go, oh, yeah, that's cool. But they're not then sure what to do with it. But if you break it down a bit, and you can break it down into what's it made up of? And, so what's the data set? What have they done with that data? How have they presented it? What's the visual? And then what does it reveal? What are the different angles in it? You could maybe also do a quick search or use a tool to find out how it was covered as well. What were the headlines? What did journalists write about it, if you wanted to take it to that step as well? And then also maybe break down, how could they have come up with this idea? And I did this quite a bit. There's an ebook on my site about 31 content campaigns, and it shows you how different creatives have come up with their content ideas. But in advance of that, I tried to guess how some of them had come up with them, and I discovered a few things. One, there's a number of ways they could have reached the same idea. Two, I was usually wrong, but it didn't matter that I was wrong. It showed me that this is how I would have come up with it.
Yeah.
Obviously, their experience and their knowledge is different, but you can kind of break down, okay, if they started with the data set, how would they have maybe discovered that data set in the first place? And then what would they have asked or thought that got them to the idea? Or is there another format like this that maybe would have led them to this? So I saw Neil Mann put out this cool thing recently about the vocabulary of famous world leaders.
Okay.
And I was like, I know where they got that from. They got that from the vocabulary of hip hop, which was an old piece. And I was actually kicking myself in that one. I was like, that's so obvious because of the trend around, people complaining about Trump not being the most eloquent in his speech and maybe not that intelligent. Let's not get into politics and all that jazz. But, I'm sure that's another thing you got to think about, what was going on in world discourse that maybe made this a relevant thing to discuss now. But you think, okay, I know where they maybe got the inspiration from that idea, or maybe they discovered something that people were talking about in the news, and how could they have got there? So if you spend time, this is like the practice that you do. I did a talk recently where I was kind of talking about professional boxers. If you think about or any professional sports people, think about all the practice they do, practicing their skills before they get in the ring. I think we put an awful lot of pressure on ourselves if we're not doing any practice to build the muscle, to build the technique before we need it. Otherwise, you're just, okay, it's game day. Let's hope I'm good.
Yeah.
And a professional sports star would never do that. And we are professionals at this, so we maybe need to do that a little bit more. I don't know if I answered your question, but I went on a ramble.
I think there's quite a few answers in there. But I think it's a good point that a lot of it, unfortunately, is practice. And that it's setting yourself up in the right way. It's being constantly curious, like you say, and looking at campaigns that do perform really well, analysing how they were put together and breaking it down and things.
Actually, I'll just... sorry. I now remember what you asked. Yeah. I think we have kind of a lot of weird preconceptions around what it means to be creative. And I think if you asked, a lot of people say, oh, I'm not creative. And it's a strange trait that we'll say that so willingly. Like I don't hear people saying, oh, I'm not logical, which probably we aren't as logical as we'd like to think. But there's this strange mystery around creativity. And I think that's because ideas can pop into our head. And therefore, like, how do you teach that? How do you develop that? But really, I think it's about the things you do beforehand. And somebody once asked me after a workshop I ran, he said, Mark, this creative stuff, isn't it all just engaging with the topic and being curious? And I thought about it, and it really stuck with me. He was a photographer, I feel like it deserves a mention, called Rupert, or did a session with the Wilderness Scotland. It really stuck with me, and I think that's a nicer way to think about it, because I think we can all engage with a topic and we can all be curious. We can all ask questions.
Yeah.
That's easy. And then it's just determining about whether that's a question anyone's answered yet, whether we can answer it, and whether that's something people would be interested in knowing. If you're interested in knowing it, that's a good start. You're probably not alone. And I think that's a little bit similar to what I was saying about when you go into a creative session. Take that pressure off and actually the main question is, what's interesting here? What are people interested in? And what else would I like to know? And sometimes it can take a while. And that question about what are people interested in is quite important, because if you're not interested in it, then your goal is to understand what they're interested in. Yeah. And if you stick with that, can take a bit longer, but if you stick with it, you will begin to get there. I've found myself empathizing and engaging in topics I never thought I would find interesting, like health and safety. I recently had to do some stuff around multi-layered ceramic capacitors for an engineering site. And you would not think that is interesting. Well, I certainly didn't think that was going to be very interesting. Once you dig in far enough, you begin to find out, I found out that essentially there's a global shortage in these things, and they're in everything that we use. So your iPhone X has 10,000 of these in it, and there's a global shortage of them. And so recently there was PlayStation 5 and GoPro couldn't produce enough of their product because of the shortage of this thing. And I was also understanding that because of companies like Apple and Tesla who have increased demand in this thing, they'll get theirs, but the smaller manufacturers and the smaller companies probably won't get theirs, and that will actually cause those product lines to just stop, or their factories to close or stop producing for a while. But you just had to dig further and begin to understand, oh, right, okay, there is something interesting here. But it takes a while.
But you got there, and there's that nice kind of entertainment lifestyle big story there, actually, from what actually, at the start looks like something very dull.
Yeah, for sure.
And you mentioned kind of, examining and just questioning things. And I might be wrong, so correct me if you think I'm wrong, but there's this myth that we need to bring complete ideas to the table. And actually, you might think you see something which is so interesting, but you might not know quite what to do with it. And someone else might be able to take that and do something really remarkable with it.
Yeah.
So I think there needs to be less kind of, oh, you need to have a completely finished idea sometimes, and just say, look, guys, I think there's something really cool here. I don't quite know what. We need to add to it somehow. What can we do with it?
Yeah, that's a great point. There's something that we need to kind of get comfortable with early on. So there was a study done with jazz musicians where they hooked them up to this brain, like these machines where they monitor your brain activity, and they were monitoring when these musicians got into a state of flow, and they were improvising and creating music that had never been created before, and they were trying to see, is it the left brain that lights up or the right brain or something like that. And there was a pattern in that, but it wasn't the most interesting one that they discovered. The main one was about the front part of the brain. And when they really got into this state of flow, the front part of the brain the activity dampened down. And that front part of the brain is where we it's like the social brain, and we try to predict what will happen when we take an action. What will people think? What if this doesn't work? What if it's no good? And I ask people when they're trying to brainstorm, what things they're saying to themselves that get in the way. And it's like, oh, it's probably already been done. Someone's probably already come up with it. We probably can't get the data. It's probably not very good. All these things. And we have to get comfortable with switching that off and just appreciating that most of what we come up with initially won't be good and won't go anywhere. I like to have 60 to 80 ideas at least before I start to filter them. Now, a lot of them will be loose, a lot of them will be rubbish, and I'll only present 3 of them, which means 77 of them weren't good enough, right? But that's fine, and that's like, I don't know what the percentage is, 95%. So you just got to get comfortable with that. That is part of the process. And yeah, sometimes you might go, look, I think there's something in this, but I don't know what it is. And that's it. That's the engagement. That's the resonance. That's the something in your body speaking to you, going, there's something here. I don't know what it is. And yeah, sometimes in conversation, sometimes I think conversations are a very creative act in themselves, but you have this idea and you start pulling threads out. I'd want to know this, or what about this? And sometimes people, oh, it reminds me of this thing, and the thing spirals and you end up somewhere, sometimes quite different as well. But yeah, I think that's quite important. The only caveat I put to that is I have seen sometimes where that's all people generate, and they go, we could do something with this, we could do something with this, we could do something with this. That's okay, but I would say you've only really done half the job there. And so the next step is you could consider that the research, you found the engagement, now to add the curiosity. And people maybe just don't know what to do with that. I would just come back and brainstorm questions, just dump questions. What would you want to know? Okay. And I think actually questions are a good way of getting away from the format thing, because it's like, ignore how we might create this later. Put that aside and just go, what question do you have? What would you like to know? Just at a very personal human level, and brain dump your questions around it. And that can be a nice starting point. But yeah, I've definitely had a few. Actually, on that note as well, there was a few ideas come out of conversations. There's a guy that is absolutely brilliant at coming up with these kind of viral social campaigns that I used to work with at Distilled, called Matt Round. He has his own site called vol.wtf, where he makes all kind of weird and wonderful stuff. And he would always sit down with me, and before we discussed these ideas, he would always say, these are probably all rubbish. And like, he's really good at it, and they're never all rubbish. But, actually, if saying that helps you. So, if you go, look, I'm just sharing these, there's probably a bunch of rubbish. There's, they're very loose. I'm not even sure where I'm going with them. Whatever frame you need to put around it to make you comfortable sharing it, that could be really useful. So you're not saying, I'm not, because I think people feel their ideas are a representation of themselves. Yeah. And they're like, and a representation of their work and their abilities. And it's like, look, these are just thoughts that sprung to mind, and I'm sharing them because maybe you can see something in them.
Definitely. I think that's a really good point, because I think when you put an idea forward, well, me personally, I feel there's a responsibility that idea is decent. And because if someone's going to take it and use it for a campaign and it's not great, that's on you. And I still, I still to this day feel responsible for all the ideas I put forward. And I just really, really hope they're going to land. So I can imagine how much pressure there is on people, when they are putting forward these ideas, because you just don't know. With the best will in the world, you don't quite know how things are going to land. So yeah, is there anything that we can do to kind of manage, I don't know, those concerns?
So I think, people, you said actually at the start of this, there's no such thing as there's no stupid questions. This is for the Q&A afterwards. You might get some stupid answers, but I'll try my best. But, people have this saying that there's no such thing as a bad idea. Now, obviously there is. Like, there's a guy in my office thought it'd be a good idea to make sausage pencils. Now, I can see that those would probably poison you. Lead and not a good idea. That's a bad idea. But obviously the intent behind that is, at a certain stage when you're generating and presenting ideas, we are not going to critique. And I think that's quite important. I was saying, turn this little critic off in your head, but also realize when we're sharing initial ideas, it's easy to critique. Don't jump to critique too soon. The initial stage, our aim is to keep ideas alive and focus on which ones are speaking. So you share yours and people will tell you, I see something in this, and then we try to build on them. Well, what could we do with that? And so don't critique them too early. I think we need to, as individuals, understand that it's part of the process and that it's absolutely okay to share, whatever ideas, and if you need to put a frame around that to make you more comfortable. But also, I think as a team, we maybe need to collect, like whatever team you're working in, collectively understand that this is part of the process and that's what happens early on, and keep the critiques out of the way. Because if people feel critiqued as soon as they share something, that will touch a nerve, and they'll be less likely and willing to share in future. And we need to avoid that entirely at a certain stage of the process. Let's just get the ideas out and discuss what's working well. And I know that some agencies maybe do brainstorms with clients. I would never do that, because that's like pressure. Because as I've said, honestly, most of my initial ideas are crap. I'll happily axe everything I've come up with and start again. And this is like that. You don't want people to see how the sausages are made. You want to impress a client by showing them your best work. That's a pressure. And if you go in and show them all this complete nonsense that you come up with initially, that I would feel self-conscious about that. But I don't feel that self-conscious. I do a little, but I don't feel that self-conscious when sharing it with my team, and we've got to get used to opening things up for feedback and have a nice culture of kind of sharing and encouraging and looking for what's positive initially and building on that. There's a time for critique, but don't bring it in too early.
And something that we haven't discussed is what you do when you feel really passionate about an idea, but other people don't get it or aren't on board with it. How some people just know something's going to be a success, and you just feel like you have to go with your gut.
But you can't convince anyone that it's good?
Well, not nobody.
Okay.
I'm just talking generally. I mean, I often put ideas forward that I think in my gut are going to be great. And then they're met with kind of, not with like no's, but people who aren't as excited as you are. Now, how do you manage that? Do you just think, oh, well, maybe I'm off mark here? Or should I keep going because this is my gut telling me this is going to be really good?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. So I still have a couple that I have in my back pocket, and I've put forward several times, but two of my colleagues that I really trust are just like, no. And I'm like, oh man. One of them said, it was Matt Round again. He said to me, maybe just go and make it for yourself if you really need to. But no, I mean, I've never put those ones forward. I think that is important to pay attention to. I have definitely in the past. Now, this could be particularly challenging for the leader, the person, if you're the person that has the final say, so nobody's really going to challenge you. Like when I was head of creative at Distilled, I would have the final say. Usually, I mean, some of the consultants might object strongly, but often they didn't feel confident enough in the creative process, so they would trust my judgment. I was the head of the creative team, so I kind of had the final say. And the client sometimes would just, even if they weren't sure, they're going to trust my judgment. Like, you're the expert. So you have to be particularly careful if you're in the position where no one actually will or can stop you. And I can think of ideas that I've pushed through when I think back and I was like, I should have seen that nobody was really responding. Yeah, the main thing you're looking for is one of two things. Is it clear and is it compelling? So when you just find the shortest way of mentioning it, without even pitching it, just find the shortest way of mentioning it to someone and notice whether, if they look confused, then maybe it's just a clarity issue. But if they just don't look moved at all and you can't get anyone moved, then that's kind of where we have to be, quite honest with ourselves, I think. And it could be that nobody's in that market, but then maybe go and try and find someone that responds to it. But yeah, that's a good warning sign to be aware of. It's a difficult one though. Like, I think what it is when you have an idea, you make a new connection in your brain and you get a rush of some chemical. Maybe it's dopamine. I don't know enough about neurology, but when you make that connection, you also get a neurological reward and you attach that to the idea. So that's now your emotional attachment to the idea because you had that experience at the same time it came up. But nobody else is having that emotional attachment to the idea. And, if we can't convey that, then that might be why we fall in love with our ideas and others don't. It always reminds me of, this is quite bad, but when like maybe you had a partner in the past and then when you finally get rid of them, terrible language, but you're, oh my God, we never liked them. And you're like, why did no one say anything? But it's like, it's a little bit like that.
On that note, Okay, so we touched on kind of starting points very briefly. I'm conscious of time too, because I don't want to keep everyone too long, but I know there's much to cover and I could talk to you all day. But going back to starting points, are there any additional starting points that you think people should know about?
I don't know if I would tell anybody anything they wouldn't be aware of, but in terms of sources of inspiration, so one of the most valuable things you can do is sit down for like quite a prolonged period, like maybe a Saturday morning. We're in lockdown, it's pretty boring. Saturday morning, get a nice coffee, sun's shining these days, maybe sit by a window or outside and just pick a site and trawl through it and find like a site that has loads of inspiration. So like the Information is Beautiful awards, like pudding.cool, like digital PR examples, content curated, where else? There's like, you can look at the best of the New York Times each year. They do stuff like that. Wherever you enjoy going, find one that you do enjoy. You do find that they're creating content that you like, and go through the whole thing. Now that sounds crazy, and maybe you won't achieve it in one day, but I've done that on multiple sites. And Pinterest or whatever you use, get a visual snapshot somewhere you can easily access it. So do that for source. That will really, really help you in multiple ways you might not even be aware of. Starting points. I mean, one thing I think I find quite useful is finding, like the Goldilocks principle, finding the right size of topic area. So whether you go to BuzzSumo, whether you go to Google News, or whether you just do a site search on, say if it was tech, you go to TechCrunch. But sometimes if you pick too broad an area, then you tend to skim the surface and not really get into the depths of what people are talking about. And that can be a challenge as well. So the way I look at it is, if I can pick off a topic area that, if I'm in Google News, that maybe there's only 30 pages of results in the last year on this topic. So a topic like tech will be far too big, but a topic like the IoT or artificial intelligence might be a bit more manageable. And maybe you want to start at the top level and find out the really popular topics. And maybe it's electric vehicles, or maybe it has to be even smaller to EV charging. But if you pick off a topic area that is shown to be resonant and talked about, but you kind of go, I'm going to dig deep in this and understand everything that gets talked about. Probably like in one publication or Google News or a tool like Ahrefs, BuzzSumo, then you can begin to reach the point where you actually understand what people talk about, and then you'll understand which of your ideas are likely to be picked up or not, and particularly in an area you don't know. That can be really useful, because otherwise we're often just skimming the surface and going, oh, artificial intelligence, okay, that's a thing, so maybe we could look at the top artificial whatever. And that might not be a bad idea, but that's the way that we also end up with that topic plus format, because we didn't dig in to find out what do people actually talk about with artificial intelligence. So that's more an approach than a starting point, but I don't use that many fancy starting points in terms of research. I just kind of dig deeper, I think, and kind of try to figure out exactly what people talk about.
Definitely. I think that's a really good point on not kind of being too broad. And sometimes, you know, from my own personal experience, you have the opposite situation where you've got a very kind of tight, restricted topic, and you're not looking broad enough, or you're looking way too broad. So it's sometimes finding that middle ground.
Yeah, so I mean, I have used the system. So I use BuzzSumo a lot. That's my usual starting point. But if I put a topic into BuzzSumo, a very specific topic. So I was once asked to brainstorm around motors for motorized blinds. And they actually wanted the story to be about motorized blinds. So I'd like, okay, I put motorized blinds into BuzzSumo. There were less than three articles in the last year, less than that I've got any engagement over 20 shares. And I'm like, right, okay, so this is not a topic, okay? Yeah. And I can show that now with data rather than opinion. But then similarly, okay, so I picked, let's say it's artificial intelligence. It's probably bigger. I then look how many results are there with more than 50 or 100 engagements. And if it's round about sort of 20, 30 pages, which will be double, so that's like 400, 600 articles, that tells me this is quite a rich but also manageable area. I could get through those 30 pages by scanning the headlines in a couple of hours. Now I understand everything that gets engagement in the last year on this topic. And now I have a much deeper understanding, and I'll be able to come up with ideas that are more relevant to what they talk about.
Brilliant. Okay, that's a nice kind of point to kind of wrap it up. And I can see that we've got lots of questions. And what's really helpful actually is Webinar Ninja have added a voting system, so I can see what the most popular questions are. So yeah. Bear with me.
Yeah, glasses on. That's quite a lot. 20 votes. That's popular.
Okay. We probably won't have time to do all these, but let me start from the top. Right, we'll start with Sally. So Sally says, do you have any favorite ideation tactics, e.g. rapid word association, a personal favorite, or brain writing, etc.?
I don't know if this is the same as rapid. Well, so tactics in that sense, my favorite one is researching, but I don't think that's what you mean. When I'm researching though, I will scan. I'll have two windows open, one with where I'm researching and one with the doc. And let's say I go into BuzzSumo, I scan all the headlines. If there's anything I find interesting, I capture that. I also try to, if I want to know a bit more about it, I open it up in a new tab and I'll dig in a little bit and maybe make a note or two about what it was about. But I try to capture I try to sit with it for a second and go, what would I like to know about this? Or what does this remind me of? Sometimes just notice whatever springs to mind. Sometimes it will remind you of a conversation you had with someone. Sometimes it will remind you of another piece that you saw. Capture all of that at the time. So you might end up with, okay, here's a link. Here's what it's about. Here's what sprung to mind. Like, it reminds me of this, reminds me of this. Maybe we could do this, or I'd be curious to know this. And I just capture all the thoughts that spring to mind. There could be memories, ideas, questions, and then I move on and I do that. So I don't think that's strictly a technique. In terms of techniques, I do like mind mapping a topic just to kind of really expand everything that I think around it. And then once I've mind mapped it, I will brain dump ideas off of it. And then I'll also brain dump questions, because I find questions can give a slightly different answer, and sometimes a more focused answer than an idea, but it depends how you think. So I do like mind mapping. I haven't really done the other two. I think in a way I am sort of brainwriting, but just in a less formalized process.
Great. Okay. So, question from Lauren. How do you feel the pandemic and ongoing restrictions have impacted ideation? Has it made it harder, or have there been ways to deal with the barriers faced?
So, I mean, I don't think this is quite what you mean, but there's been restrictions about what we can really talk about. And I've seen some people be very creative with ideas in the travel space during times when we cannot travel, pieces about armchair travel and the places we want to go back to. And I saw a piece about like views from people's windows around the world, and a piece about how books can help us travel. So I was impressed with that creativity arising to the challenge. I think you mean more the in-person brainstorming. In truth, I'm not the biggest fan of in-person brainstorming. I don't really like getting in a room and coming up with ideas. I prefer everyone to go away and do some research and generate ideas first, and then get into the room, and maybe we start to bounce around the ideas that we have. I think that's more useful. But yes, the important thing is that when you're doing the in the room is kind of the energy and the mood, and obviously that is a little harder over Zoom. So I've never been the biggest fan of it. Also, when you're going to have discussions about ideas, I would keep it to 2 of you or 3 of you. 6, 7 people in a room is really difficult for everyone to be involved and to keep the conversation fast. I think often we're in there because we want everyone to be involved, but maybe it'd be better splitting that out a bit or something. It's an awful lot of people, and it tends to make it a bit more like a meeting and less of a creative conversation.
Definitely.
So,
and I guess those that are more opinionated are just, sit and say more.
I know that people do, like to be able to, some people get more energized by brainstorming with others. The only challenge I'd put about that as well is that's when you maybe do want to have systems like your rapid word or mind map, because otherwise, if it's just throwing ideas out, you tend to not generate very many. If you have 6 or 7 people in a boardroom, and how many ideas do you come out with? If of all 6 or 7 of them had spent an hour individually generating ideas, I bet is way less. So that's one of my concerns with that.
That's true. Yeah, that's much more kind of structured way of doing it as well, rather than just hoping it's going to be an effective time spent.
Yeah.
So that answers Chloe's question about kind of remote working and managing brainstorming with teams. So I've got a question from Tonjay. Apologies if I haven't pronounced that correctly. What is your take on surveys? Unless they are of substantial size, more than 2,000 respondents, is it even newsworthy? What is a more creative solution to surveys?
So I think 2,000 is kind of the benchmark for responses in Britain. I think it's different in America. To be honest, if you really want to check that, just do some Googling to see about studies and number of respondents and find out how many they have. But I think 2,000 is kind of the standard number. What is a more creative solution to surveys? It obviously depends. It depends what question you're trying to answer. But yeah, try to think if there are ways that you could answer that with data rather than surveys, because it's just a bit more interesting. It's usually a bit more substantial. So I mean, something that springs to mind is obviously if you were wanting to find out about the most popular movies, you wouldn't go to surveys, right? You would go to IMDb and you would look at their data, or you would look at some other data source. But sometimes you can be more creative about how you generate data. But that's a really difficult question to answer so generically. I guess a more creative solution to surveys as a data source is when you are collecting lots of interesting stuff that you've seen, notice what data source they've used, and think about what else you could do with that. You know, the guys at Verve, when they came up with the swearing in film thing, they had seen a piece on pudding, which is an amazing site. You should check everything they do. It's usually very innovative. So if you want to copy them, then you'd probably be doing pretty well. But they had done a piece about gender dialogue in films, and by scanning lots of scripts, and the guys at Verve were like, what else could we do with this data set? And they remembered seeing something about the amount of swearing in different movies like Uncut Gems, and thought maybe we could do something on that. So look for the data sources and interesting content that you see, and think about what else would be interesting to know about that data.
Brilliant. That's a good answer. I got a question from Ellie, and she said, what advice do you have for people starting out in digital PR? Who or what should we be following and learning from in the industry?
Oh, I was looking at a different question. What was this? Oh yeah, starting out, what advice do you have for people? I was getting confused because I was reading a different question. Right, who or what should we be following, learning from in the industry? Starting out in digital PR, you should be following Jane and the guys at JBH, and you should be coming to these webinars, which you're doing, so you're taking good steps. Yeah, I think you'll begin to find the people to follow within that space. You'll see the same names cropping up here and there. Some of those sites I mentioned, like the Digital PR Examples is good, the Content Curated is good. They tend to be two of the most prevalent ones that are capturing stuff within our industry. I would encourage you to find stuff outside the industry, though. That's what I think is most valuable. So look at data viz sites like Pudding, or if you're not really into data viz, find another form of content that you like maybe go to more design-led sites, like some of these. Maybe you can get stuff from the viral sites like Board Panda, or maybe you can go to more design-led sites like This Is Colossal. And then who else? What should we follow and learn from in the industry? I would pay attention to conferences are obviously great for this stuff. And I really like Verve's Outreach Conference because it's so focused on what we do. I don't know when they're doing one next, but I would look at the stuff they're creating, learn how to dismantle it. That's kind of the biggest thing that you'll learn for yourselves. Look at what they've created, break it down into what's this made up of, and then how could they maybe have come up with this idea, and then think about, so how could I come up with those ideas? That's the most useful thing you could do. I could list a bunch of people, but I think if you just go in that space, you'll see them crop up enough.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm aware of time. So last question. This is a good one, actually, to kind of round things off. So Emma asks, ideation and presentation tips have been fantastic. How do we ensure we complete the process and impress the client? Any hacks on pitching? That's a good question.
Yes, I have a couple of hacks on pitching. I actually discovered the word hack originates from Hackney recently, which is where I live, but I'm not going to go into that story because time is of the essence. I feel like I should tell you, a hack, they used to sell horses in Hackney, and they weren't like prime horses, but they got the job done. So it wasn't great, it was fine, but got the job done, and that became known as a hack. How do we ensure we impress the client? Tell the story of the idea. So what I mean by that is, don't come in and say, imagine you haven't seen The Sixth Sense and I tell you what the twist is at the end. If you watch The Sixth Sense and you find out the twist, you're like, oh, because there's all these different points that you were able to connect that make sense. But if I just tell you before you see it, you'll be frustrated, obviously, that I've ruined the film for you, but you also won't have any context attached to that to understand why that makes sense. So tell the story of your idea in the same way. I'll try to do this quite quickly for you, but so you might, what's one that I came up with? Okay, I'm just trying off the top of my head, but we're working with a VPN client, and one of the things that VPN does is it protects your data. And so I was researching around data and data breaches, because obviously that's related to what they do. And I discovered that there are loads of news stories constantly about data breaches in the news. There was one about Facebook, and it showed, and if you dug into that story, it told you that they'd lost something like, I can't remember the numbers, like, but let's say it's like 1.4 million passwords, and let's say it was like 600,000 dates of birth and 400,000 like religion statuses, and it really detailed everything. And then there was Marriott, and it told you the number of credit card details they'd lost, the number of driving licenses, passports they'd lost. And I also discovered that there was a piece that showed all the different it was on Information Is Beautiful, that showed all the different data breaches and how many records they've lost in total. But none of them showed you the total number of passports, the total number of credit card details, the total number of birth dates. And that stuff to me was actually even more personal. Like, God, they're sharing, that's what's been discovered. So I felt there was an opportunity there to create a piece that was similar to what they'd done, but to show the total volume of passport details that have been lost and the total volume of driving licenses. And then within that, we would break it up by which companies have lost them all. And there'd be loads of insights we could do there. But so that's how and then I would tell them, okay, so we can get the data here, and here's how I would visualize it, and I would promote it to these sites, and this is what the headlines would probably be. So that's kind of walked them through how I got to the idea, that it was relevant, that it gets talked about, that there was an opportunity that hadn't been done yet, and then here's how we would make it, and here's what it would look like, and here's what they would write about. I've taken them through the whole process, rather than you just sending over a list of 5 ideas that said, oh, we could show the number of passports that have been lost, we could show, and then another idea, and then another idea, and another idea. They have nothing to really connect that to, so they have to judge it in isolation. Yes. They have to just be like, do I think this is an idea or not? Whereas you've just opened up a bunch of things that they can now connect to, and if they make that connection in their brain, remember what I was saying earlier, it's like they had the idea. It's like at the end of Sixth Sense, and you join it up and you go, oh, they do the same thing. And they go, oh, wait, I get it. That makes sense. And now they're actually as attached to the idea as you are, because it's like they had it. There's a phrase in advertising where the result you're aiming for is a small reaction in the client's head. Well, they're talking about the final customer, but that's what you're looking for. And so if you just present the idea, they don't have the context to be able to make that connection. Also, if you just present your ideas in a list, like here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, what they think, because they've told me this, is that you just sat in a boardroom for an hour and just spat these off the top of your head. Whereas when you present it in a story, they see the work and the thought that went into it, and it just all clicks together nicely, and they go, yes, that makes sense. And they also, if you're charging for ideation, they can then see why they were charged for it. So there, hopefully that's helpful.
No, that is really helpful. So thank you for walking us through that. And that's a really nice way to kind of wrap up the webinar. So thank you, Mark. That's so interesting. And like I said earlier, we could have talked all day. I feel like this is such a big subject. So maybe we'll do like a part 2 at some stage.
Yeah, I'd be very happy to.
Yeah, because there's so many questions here. So there's more to cover.
Yeah, I mean, if you're really like down to get your question answered, you can tweet me and I'll answer it.
Perfect. Well, thank you again for joining us, Mark. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I found it really useful and insightful, so I hope you have too. And before you leave us, I just want to let you know about the next webinar. We have the fabulous Gina Tonic, that's her moniker. She's joining us. She's an amazing writer. She's written for Vice, she's written for Cosmopolitan, loads of amazing publications. And she's going to be kind of giving guidance on how to get more cut through when pitching. And I don't know whether you saw one of the tweets from one of the journalists the other day on Budget Day, but their inbox was just, budget comment, in loads of boring subject lines. So we're going to be talking about how you can get some cut through in your subject line, how you can be more personable, and how you can actually attract attention. And if you've seen Gina Tonic, this is going to be really fun and really interesting. So have a look out for her on Twitter, have a look at what she's doing. And then I haven't got a date yet, but I will let you all know soon. So thank you again to Mark, and I will see you all soon. Thank you. Bye.